Hello and welcome to the next in our series of Old Homes of Orangevale as we review the Many-Hatted House, which was part of our June 2022 member meeting and is being re-recorded in this format. The home for today's topic is one of the very first built in Orangevale, the Orangevale Colony, and it was built on track 166. The picture you see on this slide is from the pamphlet that was published by the Orangevale Colonization Company. It's called A Souvenir of Orangevale. And there was a great picture of this home in that pamphlet and also some good information around what it was being used for. The 1889 annual report for the Orangevale Colonization Company mentions 4 homes being built along with the villa, which we've already talked about in a previous recording. And this particular home was built on track 166. 2 of the homes had been sold already per the annual report, but 2 were left over and still unsold. And those were able to be used as temporary housing for a couple of the residents that were moving in. One of those is one of the famous families of Orangevale, the Landis family, and then also Sulcer, who was also building a house in Orangevale. So they used this particular house, I believe this one was Landis, was using this house for his temporary hotel as he built his home, which is currently gone, but was on the property where the Orangevale Water Company currently resides. So first hat for this house, a hotel. Now we move on to the other next purpose for this building, and that was the on-site office for operations for the colony. The Orangevale Colonization Company did have a supervisor that was residing on the property and working on things. And we see from the historic survey that was done of the Warhoftug house, and this happens to be the house we're doing this presentation on, that the house was originally built in 1888, and that, as we mentioned already, the annual report shows it's one of the ones that had been built by the Colony Corporation. And it's said here that it was built as a headquarters for the Colonization Company, and it was on track 166, as we've seen, across the street and on the southeast corner of Chestnut and Central. Now, the house currently, for those that are keeping track, it resides on the southwest corner of those intersections, and it's on track 167. So keep track as we're going through these different hats. But that would make this a construction hat for this house, as they dealt with putting in new water piping, getting Orangevale properties that were sold to folks that are doing, I guess, remote. They would do investments, and so they would actually manage the properties for some of the other people that had purchased tracts and that weren't actually living on site. And so they had quite a few things to do out of this property. Our house then shows up in one of the other articles or media that we had when we went over the house that William Randolph Hearst had built in Orangevale for the San Francisco Examiner prize from 1892, 1893. And in that big front page ad for promoting the Orangevale Colonization Company and their new agricultural community, we have 4 homes that are being shown in that front page San Francisco Examiner paper, and one of those happens to be the house we're talking about today. We have on the left is the Ratcliffe House, which we haven't talked about yet. The house that we are talking about is noted to be the residence of W.H. Edwards, who happened to be the second superintendent of the Orangevale colony. And then we have the 2 homes that were built after they used a bit of hoteling. That was the Landis home and the Sulcer home. Those all showed up in the Examiner paper, and it was a neat way to validate that we had the house correct, and it's the one we were looking to track down in our history books. The next hat for our busy house was dealing with communication in 1891. What was neat was there was no power per se back in 1891, but they did have telephones, and those were the new and up-and-coming communication method for the United States. And for this particular house, what was great, the souvenir of Orangevale had this nice picture of the home. And in that picture, if you look carefully, you can see that there is a pole there with two resistors. It shows the connections for the telephone line, and this is validated with a couple of articles we found. The first one here, or actually this is the one, the Orangevale colony is now connected directly with the whole state by telephone, with a station at the Orangevale Villa, which we've talked about before, and another at the superintendent's house, which was Mr. Edwards. The line is new and works well. Well, I would certainly hope so, given that it was a brand new telephone line and telephones hadn't been around that long yet. So yes, our next hat was a communications hub for Orangevale. Well, Mr. Edwards, the second superintendent of the colony, was a very busy man. In that same time period, we have mail starting into the colony. And so a post office was set up, and he became the first postmaster for Orangevale in 1891. And this house happened to be the place where they were going to deliver the mail and have mail available to the colonists. And so in 1891, you can see the article that talks about that. And then we had also an article in 1961 that's looking back at the history of the post office in Orangevale, and it mentions Mr. Edwards having this first post office in his house at Chestnut and Central, and it also validates that Sol Warhoftig had the house in later years, and there's the address of 6501 Chestnut, which is where it stands today. So yes, you've got mail was yet another activity worked on through this house. Very busy house. But wait, there's more. Yes, Weather Underground, 1891 style. You would think Mr. Edwards was busy enough with everything he had going on, but he stuck his neck out to become a weather observer for Orangevale. And here in an article from 1891 as well, he mentions that he's been appointed the United States Signal Service Observer at the Vale. It's kind of funny how this reads out. The residents of that place will naturally expect the genial superintendent to furnish them with a satisfactory and agreeable quality of the article named, and will hold him responsible for north winds, frosts, and fogs. Yes, like he has control. We all do like to blame the weatherman or the weather person, don't we? And then another article mentions how they were going to be showing off the weather. They didn't have your internet websites. So he was going to fly flags at Orangevale, indicating the character of the weather we'd be expecting over the next 24 hours. We don't have any information on what the flags looked like, if they were lightning bolts on them or clouds or suns, but they had some sort of way to do that. And at some point, we'll have to look at the Signal Service from the United States and see if they have perhaps some material on that. So yes, a weather station for Orangevale and for this busy house. Now, when we're dealing with historical data, we really try to make sure we have multiple data points from different sources to be able to validate what's going on in a particular time. Sometimes we don't have that luxury, but when we do, we try to make sure we cross-check. And then if there's any kind of discrepancies, we call those out, and we can either say we know this one's right or this one's wrong, or we say, well, we're not sure which one is, but here's what we have. So in the case of, in this particular house and the families and stuff, the first thing we see in the chronology is that the Warhoftigs arrived in Orangevale in 1890, and we have an article from the Folsom Telegraph on that topic. And in this same venue, we have track 166. If you remember, that's where the house was originally built. And Mr. Fuller is shown in the real estate transaction records that he had purchased that tract in 1891. But what's interesting is Mr. Edwards, as we saw previously in 1891, 1892, 1893 actually, when the Examiner printed their front page, they showed Edwards as being the resident of the house. So it might be that Mr. Fuller purchased it and is having them manage the orchard for him, and that's the way they could use the house still. But we do see that Fuller did in fact own the property in 1891. And then the next item we have going through the track 166, 167, the Warhofdigs. The next thing is in the 1896, we see that Moses Warhofdig transferred the property, track 194, to Peter Warhofdig. And this particular piece of property is directly south. It's a 10-acre tract, just like all the other ones. It's directly south of track 167, which is where the house currently resides. So that kind of gives you information on that. And then finally, on this slide, we have track 167, which is where the house eventually ended up, was purchased for the very first time by Peter Warhofdig in 1902. And the reason we know it's the first time is because the Orangevale Colonization Company was the owner, and then they transferred it to Warhofdig. So there was no other private owners before then of that tract. Now, the Warhofdigs had a lot of problems with fire, and so this is an interesting little tidbit on fires. They had the first fire that's mentioned is in 1902, which happens to be the same year they purchased tract 167. And it mentions that they had a fire and it actually destroyed the house, but they didn't own tract 167 yet in May of 1902. They actually purchased it in November of 1902. So that's something good to remember. And it mentions here it's the second time in 2 years that they've suffered from fire. So they didn't do too well there. And then another fire came up in 1923, and this was from another small house. It was on one of the properties, not their main house, which we know is still with us. And then yet another article in 1923 talks about there being a site where one burned down 2 years before that. So that would have been 1921. So there was a lot of fires over the years with the Warhofdigs. Bad luck with that. But what's interesting is the historic survey of the Warhofdig house mentions that that Fuller bought the tract by 1996. We saw that it was actually 1891. And then they talk about in the survey that the house was apparently moved across the street to 167, which is true, which was owned by the Warhofdig family. Now, the Warhawks didn't own it until 1902, so we have a bit of a gap there, 1896 to 1902 in this historic survey. And then when they mention that the first Warhofdig house on the southwest corner of Central and Chestnut burned in a fire, and that he purchased the house across the street and moved it to his lot, that's not quite accurate. So his house would have had to have been on the 10-acre parcel just south of tract 167. That's the one they bought back in 1896. And then it looks like we don't have any data on them actually moving the house, but they would have had to move the house after they purchased it in the end of 1902 in order to have the house end up there when they owned it. So it's a little bit of a discrepancy in the historic survey, and that's one of the reasons why you want to dig as far as you can before you figure out or trust a particular source. Now we'll get into the Warhofdig years. Now we finally have the house moved to the tract 167 where it sits today, and it was a home sweet home for them. It didn't burn down like some of the other properties they had. But they were really big into fruit. Mr. Warhofdig had prize prunes that he got rewards for. He had pickled olives. He was quite diverse. We had articles on him having apples and apple cider, citrus products. So he really was very diverse when it came to the orchards and stuff. So this was not only a home for them, but was the headquarters for their operations when it came to the orchard products. And then we have Orangevale, and of course water. We've always needed water in Orangevale. It was one of the big draws for folks to come here because there was guaranteed irrigation for the orchards. And the Orangevale Water Company, which was founded in 1895, you can see here Mr. Katzenstein was the original president director of the water company. And what we found is in the historical survey that was done for the Warhoftig house that Sol Warhoftig, who was the son of Peter Warhoftig, was very busy in the water company. And here we see that the house served as an office for Sol Warhoftig during his service as principal officer of the Orangevale Water District. And it's like, where else can we see that? Well, if you look at the 100-year anniversary pamphlet put out by the water company, they had a list of all the directors, and one of those was Sol Warhoftig, shown in 1923 as being a director of the Orangevale Water Company. So that was a good validation there. And then with the rest of the historical survey, it talks about that he was the vice president, he became president, he remained in the position until 1929. He maintained the water company offices in his home on Chestnut Avenue, functioning without assistance until 1934 when a secretary was hired. So we see that yet another hat is being worn by this busy house, and that was the headquarters for the Orangevale Water Company for quite a while during the 20th century. And so we go into the modern age. This is a current Google Street view of the house there at Chestnut and Central. Beautiful home, still looking very good. We were not able to get a hold of the current owners of the property, but you can see it, of course, from the street and enjoy that house. The Warhoftigs kept the property in the family until 1989. And that's when that historical survey was done, and we see that from 1990. We've got a copy of that from the archives. The development was done in the property, but they were able to save the house because of its historical significance. It didn't get an official, it went through the registry process for historical buildings, but because it was moved, that was one of the criteria to become an official National Register historic place, was that it hadn't been moved around. So not only this house, but the villa are two of the properties that are the oldest in Orangevale, and both of those have been moved, which was unfortunate. But it is still there. It stands today as one of the earliest structures, and so we are very happy to be able to celebrate that, and of course put on its house hat once again, as it's a home for another family in Orangevale. So thank you so much for listening in as we've shared on one of the old homes in Orangevale. We will continue to have those going on over the months as we go through and find more and more of these older homes, and we're glad that you can participate. Make sure you join our Facebook group, Orangevale History Project, and of course you probably are on our YouTube channel now to be able to see this. So thanks so much, and we look forward to having you join us in the future.